Hello, good evening, and welcome to the Definite Article. I'm Emily Carver. This evening, I'm delighted to be joined by Dr. Stephen Davies. Steve is the Head of Education at the IEA. Before we begin, please do leave a comment, and subscribe if you haven't already. We're producing new content every day of the week. If you are enjoying our content, do please consider making a contribution, no matter how modest. It would be a huge help to us. You can donate online at the IEA website, which is iea.org.uk. Steve is an expert on most things, but today we're going to discuss his most recent article for CapX, which is entitled "The Pandemic Will Shake Up the Welfare State. UBI will be a central part of that debate." Steve has also written a new briefing paper out today entitled "Covid-19, Redefining the State of Welfare." The paper is linked in the description box below, where you can also find Steve's article as well. So do check them out after the live stream. Please don't hesitate to ask him any questions. You can do so in the little chat box next to the video, and I'll try to get to as many as I can. So let's begin. As Steve argues in his article, major crises often bring about radical reform to the welfare state and to the welfare system. COVID-19 is likely to also trigger that same debate, and with the idea of UBI resurfacing once again. UBI has had support across the political spectrum. Milton Friedman proposed a variant. The ASI, the Adam Smith Institute, has also supported it. But advocates also include the Green Party and the former Shadow Chancellor, John McDonnell. But is it feasible? Hi, Steve. Thanks for joining me.
Hi there. Good to be here.
How are you?
Oh, all right, all right. It's unusually sunny up here in Manchester right now.
Oh, lovely. That makes a change. It's always raining when I'm there. Your article today, as I said, is entitled "The Pandemic Will Shake Up the Welfare State. UBI will be a central part of the debate." Could you start firstly by telling us why you think coronavirus will lead to a change in our welfare system, and why are you so certain that UBI will be on the table?
Right. Well, as you said in your introduction there, major crises such as major wars, or in this case, a pandemic, very often do lead to major changes in the welfare system. That's because they do two things. First of all, they tend to bring discontent with the existing way of doing things to a head, because people feel in this condition of crisis, oh, the way we were doing things was no good. I realize now we can't go on doing it that way. And the other thing they do is that they bring ideas that were formerly on the fringe into the center of the conversation. Now, there's been increasing discontent, I think, with the way that the welfare system has been working in this country, in particular with universal credit, the reform of the benefit system introduced by the coalition government. And with the lockdown, a huge number of people who would not normally go anywhere near universal credit are now experiencing how the system works. And I think that's going to add to the feeling that this is a fundamentally flawed system. Now, as to why UBI is going to then take a prominent role in the debate that I think we're all going to have, that's because for the last few years, it's been seeing quite a revival of intellectual interest. Quite a lot of people, as you say, from across the ideological spectrum, have been advocating this idea and saying that we ought to move in this direction as the foundational sort of like basis for our welfare system. And there's actually been a number of experiments tried out in various countries, such as Finland.
Steve, can you hear me?
Yes, I can, loud and clear.
I missed your sound for a little bit there. Could you just repeat that?
Well, where did you lose me?
Hang on, I'll move on to the next question, because hopefully
Okay.
the audience heard the rest of your answer. I only missed a few seconds. Now, regardless of a pandemic or not, coronavirus or not, you flirted with the idea of a UBI for a little while now. I think you were a supporter at one point. What are your new objections?
Well, it's not just for a while. I mean, I actually wrote a pamphlet advocating a universal basic income way back in the middle of the 1980s for the Centre for Policy Studies. And so for a long time, I was quite a strong supporter of it in the same sort of way that the Adam Smith Institute has been. I am still on the fence. I'm not completely against it. I'm open to persuasion to support a UBI if it's one of the right kind. But I have become increasingly concerned by a number of other issues, which perhaps I wasn't back then. One of them is the relationship with work. I think that a very serious objection to a UBI is that uh, if it's set at a level which people can live on, albeit frugally, and I think it has to be to make any kind of practical sense, then the danger is that a significant number of people will choose not to do creative work or to do their own thing, as many hope, but rather to simply live as couch potatoes. And there's evidence from the United States, for example, and the way welfare is working out there to support this. And that's extremely socially destructive. And also, at the very basic level, what this idea does is to separate income from work. And there are all sorts of reasons why people across the ideological spectrum may find that deeply problematic for both moral reasons and sociological reasons. So that's one of the main reasons why I'm increasingly skeptical. The other reason why I'm skeptical increasingly is more pragmatic. It's to do with the fact that I think, unfortunately, the kind of UBI we're most likely to see is one that is introduced simply as a top-up to the existing welfare system at a pretty low level. And that is worse than useless, because all you get is a very expensive new benefit that doesn't actually address the problems we have with the existing system that a UBI is meant to resolve. So you end up with the worst of both worlds. You're spending a lot of extra money, but you're not actually resolving any of the problems in the existing system. So paradoxically, perhaps, I and a lot of other libertarians, if you will, probably would be persuaded to support a UBI if it was truly radical. Although the problem I mentioned earlier of what to do about work and how to think about the question of work would still be there.
Yeah, I think for a lot of people, it's that sort of incentive
Yeah.
to work that's the real issue, and the moral challenge of that as well. Now, you've looked at trials in various countries. I believe there's sort of small scale experiments in
Yes.
countries like Canada, Finland, Uganda, Kenya. What can we learn from those small scale
Well,
experiments?
not a lot really. This is the problem. The experiments are both small scale. They're done typically at a local level, and also time limited. And it's very, very difficult to work out how what is intended in theory to be a radical reform of the entire welfare system can actually work out from a time limited and local study, because the people involved in it, for one thing, are typically aware that they're part of an experiment and this is going to end at some point. So they don't perhaps react in the way that they would if this was part of a larger general change in the system. Plus, also, you have the constant problem in anything like this of having a representative sample, a representative place, and things of that sort. So, actually, I'm afraid that this is a very difficult question. I do not think that actually the experiments we've had so far are very useful in terms of telling us how it would work out if we did it. Some country somewhere has got to actually bite the bullet and start the process, at least, of moving its entire welfare system in this direction before we'll have a really strong idea about what the effect of it might be. That's one of the problems, of course, because it's a high risk thing to do.
Yeah.
And so, therefore, all political classes, all governments, for good reasons, are reluctant to, undertake such a bold step.
Yeah, you also told me earlier before this live stream that trade unions have been very historically anti-UBI. What
Yes.
reasons are there for that?
Well, that's very striking. This is particularly striking in the case of Finland, where it was the Centre Party in the previous coalition government that was particularly keen on introducing a UBI experiment there. But they faced very strong opposition from the labour unions in Finland and the associated party, the Social Democrats. And the reason is this, really. First of all, typically trades unions in most countries want to see welfare benefits linked to work. either through a contribution system or through their being tied to employment. So there may be supplements to employment, but they typically prefer contributory systems. And that in turn reflects a very profound basic reality of the ethics, if you will, the moral basis of trades unionism, part of which is the idea that work is valuable, not just monetarily, but ethically and morally, and that a life of paid work is somehow not just more productive, but also more morally fulfilling than a life of idleness, which is one of the reasons, quite apart from the obvious practical reasons, why trades unions are so exercised by unemployment. And so what they are very opposed to institutionally and intellectually is the idea of severing the link between work and income. Now, of course, there are other socialists like Paul Mason, for example, who think that actually that's a good thing. In fact, the whole reason why Paul supports the idea of a UBI is partly because it would, he thinks, address the issue that Marx was very exercised about, the alienation of people from work, because it would remove the necessity to work. But there's a strong socialist tradition, as well as a strong liberal and conservative tradition, that is very hostile to that.
Where do you stand on the argument that a UBI will be necessary because of the increased use of robotics and automation?
Yeah.
Do you buy that argument?
No, I don't. That's a very popular argument at the moment. The aforementioned Paul Mason, for example, is constantly going on about this. I think that's based on a fundamental misunderstanding of what is likely to happen with automation. I think all of the evidence so far is that this wave of automation is going to be like all the previous ones. It's not going to do away with work. It's simply going to change the nature of work. We will actually probably have more jobs than we did before. It's just that they will be different kinds of jobs to many of the ones that we had before. We will have big transitional challenges, people losing one kind of job and they'll need to retrain or find a different kind of work. But I don't think that I think this idea that paid work will just disappear as a non-starter. So that's one reason that you often get given for moving to a UBI, which I think actually is wrong, because it's based on a false premise, essentially.
Yeah, you talk about universal credit and how people have witnessed the difficulties of the welfare system. What other weaknesses are there with our current system?
Well, in order to understand, okay, the weaknesses of our current system go back to when it arose, because essentially, the current welfare system we have in this country developed in a piecemeal fashion in the 1970s and 1980s. It was then, if you like, fully consolidated by Gordon Brown when he was Chancellor. Now, before the 1970s, we had the Beveridge welfare system created by the Beveridge Report in 1942. And that was based upon the idea that the ultimate main source of income was paid work and a full employment economy. But that what you had was universal benefits which replaced income for people who could not work because of either age, unemployment, or sickness. And those benefits were acquired by making contributions. They were meant to be insurance-based. That actually didn't work out. The problem with that system was what you did with people who were in work but had low pay, because they were still poor, because they were on low pay. And so you began to get a thing invented in the 60s called supplementary benefit, which was meant to be a kind of bolt-on add-on to the Beveridge system to deal with that. The problem was that it grew so fast that by the end of the 70s, it was actually larger in terms of the amount of money being spent than the whole system. And so what we've seen is a move away from a system of contributory-based universal benefits to what we have now, which is a system of income supplements, transfers from the government that top up low pay. And these, however, are means tested. And that's the fundamental problem, because with any means tested benefit, what you have is effectively very, very high tax rates on anyone who's on the benefit who then earns additional money. And with universal credit, even with the reforms the coalition government brought in, if you're on universal credit and you start to earn more, the withdrawal of the benefit means you're facing an effective marginal tax rate on the government's own figures of 80%, which is, well, that's an incredible disincentive. It's a minor miracle that anyone actually tries to do extra work if you're in receipt of UC. If a tax rate of 50% on high income earners is a disincentive, how much of a disincentive is an 80% effective tax rate on people on low pay? And also, the whole benefit is designed to provide incentives to work. And one of the ways that is actually done is by making the process of getting it very, very difficult. You have an extremely complicated application process. You don't get your first payment for 5 weeks, and it's paid on a monthly basis when a lot of people do their budgeting on a weekly basis. And this means it's very easy to get sanctioned without knowing what you've done. And it can often put people's household finances into really bad shape because their budget just doesn't match up with the cycle of the payments. And so what you have is a system that traps people in a system of dependency upon benefits because there is no incentive to either take up work or to work more than you're working, and which also is highly punitive and intrusive. So that's why there's a lot of discontent with it.
Yeah, I mean, the IEA has long called for the benefit system to be reformed and made simpler. There's clearly a real problem with the way in which our tax and welfare systems interact. Some people say that there's discrimination against family formation and also single earner households. If you were to sort of start from scratch, how would you redesign the welfare system to make it more user friendly and more beneficial? Or would you
Okay.
scrap the whole thing?
Well, there are several things you could do. If you're starting from scratch, you could go down a number of routes, which would be all of which would be better, or any of which would be better than what we have right now. I think basically means-tested benefits is definitely not what you want to do. You could go for reviving the beverage system. You could go back to a system of basically insurance benefits, which would pay old age pensions, unemployment and sickness benefit. We could probably run it the way it's done in Singapore, where it's funded through forced savings, which goes into accounts in a national provident institution, which belong to the person who's made them. Now, that would be a huge improvement on the system that we've had, and it would stop the politicians taking people's contributions and spending them, which is what they did. So that would be one way. We could go to a contributory system like Singapore. We could go for a radical universal benefit system and basically pay everybody a subsistence income, and all of the income above that would have to then be taxed at 40%. If you're worried about things like the work incentives, then you wouldn't go down that route. But yes, that would be another way of doing it. And the other thing we could do, and what we really should think about, is reviving the role of civil society as a supplement perhaps to a contributory system, or indeed to a universal payment system. And that is to revive the role of things like collective self-help, because back in the day, people talk about charity, but actually charity was marginal. What really counted was working class self-help, collective action by local people, working class people in particular, to help each other out through hard times, through things like friendly societies, affiliated orders and the like. And Beveridge, it's often forgotten, wrote a whole book about this alongside his famous report. And this is something which I think everyone from all parts of the spectrum actually should think very seriously about reviving. I mean, David Cameron toyed with this idea when he was talking about the big society, but I think unfortunately he dropped it, and we should maybe go back to that. I think what we'll end up with is actually a mixture of different systems. That's how it always will work out. But if we were starting from scratch, you could go down any one of those routes and they would all be better than what we have.
You talk about Singapore as being an example which has a better system than ours. Are there learnings that we can take from other countries other than Singapore? Are there countries in Europe that you think would be preferable or that work better?
I think that the welfare systems of quite a lot of continental Europe, while not perfect, nobody has a perfect system, obviously, are still better than ours. I think a social insurance system, which is what they have basically in Germany, for example, or in the Netherlands, is better in various ways, less likely to cause the kind of problems that we have than a means-tested benefit system. Sweden, interestingly, has a very generous welfare system, but not at all redistributive, contrary to what people believe. That's based upon universal benefits. Now, that's very expensive, and there are various reasons why you might not want to go down that route. But on the other hand, it still works better than ours.
Yeah, I'm under the lockdown with the new government measures, and they've been trying to speed up universal credit. They tried to speed up the time that it takes for
Yeah.
people to get their money. And as a result, there's been quite a lot of fraud and cheating of the system. How prevalent is that? Have you looked into it at all?
Not really. I think actually that although the amounts of money are very large, the proportion of total claims in normal times that are fraudulent is actually very low. The evidence suggests that it's less than 3%, or even less than that, actually. The thing is that the amount of money in total is so large that even 3% fraudulent claims adds up to quite a lot of pounds in the absolute sense. I suspect there's probably a lot more of it going on now than normally. Simply because, as you said, the government has relaxed those requirements they've got, and also people will be feeling the pinch for all sorts of reasons because they're laid off or not even furloughed, perhaps been made redundant. So I think you can't really draw conclusions from the level of fraudulent claims being made during a crisis. That's rather exceptional. Obviously, this is again part of the problem you have with a system which is conditional. If it is conditional, then by definition, you have to constantly be careful of people who are trying to get benefits that they're not entitled to. That's one of the arguments for having a universal or very general entitlement, where it's very easy to establish whether you're entitled to or not.
Now, one of the other things that's been proposed is universal basic services.
Yeah.
Now, I don't know a lot about this. What's the difference? Why are free marketers very against it?
Universal basic services is an idea which is actually a very old one. It was originally called the national minimum, and it was one of the central ideas of the early Fabians, like Sidney and Beatrice Webb back in the 1900s. But it pretty much vanished in the 1940s. After the National Health Service, the principle was never believed, but it suddenly had a revival in the work of people like Anna Coote, for example, and also in a proposal put forward by a number of people at UCL. Now, the idea of UBS is that instead of giving cash payments to people on whatever basis, what you do is you provide certain essential services that are supposedly essential for a civilized life, either free of charge at the point of use or at some nominal flat rate charge. And the charge in that case is really intended to manage demand so that these services are not overconsumed. Now, the National Health Service is run on that basis. And the idea essentially is that that principle should be extended to other areas. Education, where in some sense it already is, maybe food, maybe transport, housing, that's another popular one. In other words, kind of access to the internet is also quite popular these days. So the idea is that all those things will be provided by the state, either free of charge or for a nominal flat rate fee. Now, the advantage of this is that it's actually cheaper than a UBI. The disadvantage is that it's the government who decide, for example, suppose food is the thing that's being provided or housing. They decide how that should be done, what form it should take, what kind of houses should be built, what kind of food should be provided, rather than that being driven by the desires or tastes of consumers. And also the great fear, if you're a liberal, is that if you go down that route, you will end up with the state crowding out all the private provision. And you'll end up with a situation in extremis where the state actually provides all of these things and nobody else does. Now, that gives the government enormous power because it means that if they want, they can buy you from access to the essentials and necessities of life. Now, the point is that's exactly how the Soviet Union worked, because this system is actually the way the Soviet welfare system worked. They didn't have a welfare state as we understand it. Instead, the government provided these services. But as no less a person than Leon Trotsky said, this means that the old idea, who does not work, neither shall they eat, became who does not do what the party says, neither shall they eat. And that's the great risk with this kind of system. Now, you can argue, and its advocates do argue, that you can try and avoid that in various ways and have it as a kind of basis on which you would then have private sector top-ups, as you do, say, in the health system today. But that's still a big risk, and that's why I think a lot of liberals will be very leery of the idea of a universal basic services system.
Yes, to me that sounds very undesirable.
Yeah.
Just to our watchers, if you have a question, do put it to me. I will ask Steve before we finish. I've got one more question.
Okay.
Talk about UBI, how it would be a big risk to implement it across a whole country. No one wants to be the first necessarily to
Yeah.
take the plunge. In terms of practicalities, how could we even transition to a UBI? Is it not the case that we don't have a list of legal residents, for
Yeah.
example? How feasible would it be in practice? It would be a bureaucratic nightmare, perhaps.
It could be done, but it would be quite tricky. You certainly couldn't do the kind of thing where you would literally go one day from our existing system, the next day to a system of that kind. You're quite right. The British government does not actually have a single comprehensive list of every legal resident of the country because of the historic opposition of the British public to things like compulsory notification of residence and address or national identity cards. So you would have to construct such a list as the kind of in necessary precondition for moving to a system of this kind. Otherwise, you just wouldn't be able to do it. What you could do is essentially transition into it through a way, but basically by converting the existing system of universal credit into an unconditional payment. And by folding it also into the tax system. You could do this, and there have been proposals for doing it over essentially a 3 to 4 year period. So there would be quite a complicated process doing it, but if you had a clear idea of what you were doing at the end, then I think that could be managed quite easily. What would be extremely messy is what is actually more likely to happen, which is to have a kind of bolt-on benefit, which is jammed into the existing system without the existing system being changed, with no clear idea of where you're trying to end up. That would be very typically British, I'm afraid, and that would indeed be a total bloody mess, to put it bluntly.
Now, before we finish, I'm not an economist myself, but would there be an impact on prices? Would it be inflationary at all to give everyone the same amount of money? Would perhaps rents go up because they know that everyone's going to have X amount of money to pay, to spend?
No, not necessarily. That depends on how it's funded. If the benefit is funded, if a universal benefit was funded through the tax system, then it would actually be a transfer effectively, and it wouldn't. The total amount of money in the system would not change. What would change would be who had it.
Mm-hmm.
So there'd be a change in the pattern of demand, but there wouldn't be a change in the total amount of demand. If it was funded by printing money, which some of its advocates do favour, so-called modern monetary theory, public finance, then it could possibly lead to inflation if there was no spare capacity in the economy. I tend to think myself that the British economy before coronavirus was quite close to full capacity because you may say, well, okay, what about all the people who are unemployed or underemployed? Well, I think the problem is we have very severe supply side bottlenecks. So I think that if you funded it that way, you probably would get inflation in the British case. In some other cases, you might not. It would depend on how much of your economy was actually spare capacity, so to speak.
Sure. And what are your hopes for one final question? Just want to get your thoughts. What are your thoughts on our recovery from coronavirus? People were talking about a V-shaped recovery. Now people are sort of getting the longer the lockdown goes on, the more jobs are lost. People are getting less optimistic. What are your thoughts?
I think myself that we're looking at a U-shaped recovery, so-called, where we will see a very steep decline in the central quarters this year. Then, if we manage to avoid a second wave, which is still not clear that we will, but if we do, then we will have a kind of period of about a year maximum, I think, probably, where things will be very depressed and there won't be any sign of recovery. The reason being the disruption that the pandemic has brought to the world economy as a whole, not just the lockdown in this country. The evidence of Sweden, for example, is that even if you don't have a lockdown, the slowdown in the world economy in total and the effects of people's involuntarily social distancing are so great that you still take a huge hit, and that takes a long time to get over. So I think that we'd be looking at about 9 months to a year of pretty much stagnation. Then we would start to rebound very, very rapidly. What we will see, though, is that the recovery will be, certain sectors are not going to recover. I think this has probably killed off a lot of bricks and mortar retail, for example. It was already very sickly, and I think that the pandemic has probably done for it, and pretty much everyone's got into the habit of shopping online now. So although there will be a recovery, it will be a U-shaped recovery, and what will recover will not be in many ways the same kind of economy as the one we had going into it, because a lot of vulnerable sectors and firms will have been, killed off.
Yeah, we may see a very different high street moving forward.
Absolutely, yeah, and other areas too. I suspect, for example, I wouldn't be keen if I had shares in commercial property right now, because I think a lot of firms are going to discover that they do not need as much office space as they thought they did, and they're going to switch to a lot of working from home. So I think commercial property is looking at both loss of rents from stores and things like that, but also loss of rents from office space. So that's another sector that's looking down a rather bleak prospect.
Yeah, definitely. I hadn't thought about that. Thanks for joining me, Steve. That was
Pleasure.
really, really interesting. If you enjoyed this, please do leave a comment, like, and also subscribe to our channel for more videos. We're posting a new one nearly every day. You can also check out our website, where you can sign up to our new IEA daily newsletter, which gives you commentary every day, the top news, and expert analysis. And to help us keep our content going, why not consider giving a small contribution, no matter how modest? It would be a huge help to us. You can donate online at iea.org.uk. And I hope you enjoyed the discussion. Thank you, Steve.
Pleasure.
Bye.
Bye.